Elite, only table. Poor girl asked. The billionaire leaned in and whispered one line. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit CQBSCRB and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's return to our main character. The soft hum of conversation and the gentle clink of silverware filled the air inside a candlelit Manhattan restaurant, where every plate looked like a small masterpiece and every seat seemed reserved for someone important. But Lena Morales did not feel important at all as she paused just inside the doorway, smoothing down a secondhand black dress she had bought for $12 at a thrift store in Queens, her worn flats whispering against the polished floor, while her heart thumped a little too loud in her chest, because places like this were not meant for girls who counted tips at the end of the night and measured groceries down to the last dollar. She glanced at her phone again, rereading the message from her manager about covering a last-minute shift, then looked up at the room divided by invisible lines of status, the regular tables buzzing with quiet laughter, and, beyond a subtle brass sign, an elevated section with softer lighting and chairs upholstered in leather, the kind of place where the menus had no prices printed. Lena adjusted the apron at her waist, reminding herself that she was here to work, not to belong, and stepped forward with a tray balanced on her palm, moving carefully between tables, past tailored jackets and diamond watches, until she reached the edge of that raised section and hesitated, because there at the center sat a man alone at a wide round table, dark suit perfectly fitted, posture relaxed but alert, his phone set aside as if he were waiting for something or someone. For a split second, Lena wondered if she had misread the floor plan, if the lines had shifted without her noticing, and the doubt tightened her throat as she weighed the risk of embarrassing herself against the risk of getting reprimanded for ignoring a guest. She swallowed, stepped closer, and asked softly, almost apologetically, "Elite-only table." The man looked up, and in that moment, the restaurant noise seemed to fade as his eyes met hers. Steady and unreadable, not annoyed, not amused, just curious, and instead of waving her away or calling a manager, he leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear, and whispered a single line that made Lena blink in surprise and forget, just for a heartbeat, the sign, the tears, the unspoken rules of who belonged where. She stood frozen for a second longer than she meant to, gripping the edge of the tray, aware of her own reflection in the polished silverware, a girl out of place in a room that thrived on appearances. And yet something in the way he looked at her suggested that maybe, just maybe, the mistake she thought she had made was not a mistake at all, but the beginning of something she could not yet name. The words he whispered stayed with Lena Morales long after she nodded and stepped back from the table, her body moving on autopilot as she finished her route through the dining room, refilling glasses and clearing plates while her mind replayed his voice over and over again, calm and certain, saying, "Every table is elite if you are invited to it." A sentence so simple that it unsettled her more than any sharp remark could have, because it did not place her below him or above him, it simply erased the line she had been living behind for years. She tried to shake it off, reminding herself that people with money often said charming things without meaning them. But when she passed his table again, he looked up and met her eyes, not with expectation, not with ownership, but with the quiet acknowledgement of someone who had been heard and wanted to listen in return. And that made her chest tighten in a way she was not prepared for. Lena retreated to the service station, pressing her palms briefly against the cool counter, grounding herself in the familiar smells of coffee and citrus cleaner, telling herself to focus because rent was due in 4 days and charm did not pay bills, tips did. Yet when the manager whispered that the gentleman at the raised table had asked for her by description rather than by name, something in her stomach flipped. She approached carefully, keeping her posture professional, and he thanked her for the service, asking her how long she had worked here, as if the question mattered, as if the answer was not just small talk, and she heard herself answering honestly about the rotating shifts, about picking up extra hours, about how nights like this paid for mornings that were easier, and he listened without glancing at his phone or scanning the room, which felt unusual enough to make her self-conscious. When he stood to leave, he did not linger or put on a show, he simply placed a folded receipt on the table, wished her a good night, and walked out, leaving behind a tip large enough that Lena stared at the number twice to be sure she was reading it correctly, her first instinct being that it was a mistake, her second being a quiet, dangerous hope. The rest of the shift passed in a blur, and when Lena finally stepped back onto the sidewalk, the city air cool against her face, she saw him again across the street, no longer framed by candlelight and polished surfaces, just a man adjusting his coat near a black car that looked expensive but unmarked, and before she could stop herself, she crossed on the light, calling out a hesitant thank you that felt too small for what the moment carried. He smiled, introduced himself as Julian, no last name, and asked if she ever went anywhere after work that was not home or the subway, the question catching her off guard, because it was an invitation without pressure, and after a beat she admitted there was a coffee shop on 9th Avenue that stayed open late and did not care how tired you looked. Julian suggested they walk, and Lena surprised herself by agreeing, matching her pace to his as the sounds of traffic replaced the hush of the restaurant, the distance between their worlds shrinking with every block. Over black coffee and mismatched mugs, she learned he worked in finance consulting. At least that was how he put it, vague but not evasive, and he learned she carried a sketchbook everywhere, pulling it from her bag to show him quick drawings of strangers she caught on the train, their expressions unguarded, and when he told her they were good, she believed him because he did not sound impressed, he sounded certain. They talked until her exhaustion settled in fully, and when they parted, it felt less like an ending and more like a pause, the kind that promised continuation without saying so out loud. On the ride home, Lena watched her reflection blur against the window, thinking about tables and invitations and how easily a single sentence could tilt the shape of an ordinary night, unaware that the man she had just shared coffee with measured his days in boardrooms and balance sheets, and that this small detour into her world was already shifting the way he saw his own. Days passed, then a week, and Lena Morales found herself measuring time differently, not by shifts or rent reminders, but by small moments that carried Julian quietly into her routine. A message asking how her night went, a coffee waiting on the counter when she arrived at the shop on 9th Avenue. A steady presence that did not demand anything but attention. They met after her shifts when the city slowed just enough to feel human, walking without a destination, talking about things that usually stayed buried beneath survival, like how Lena had moved to New York with one suitcase and a sketchbook, because drawing was the only thing that made her feel certain, and how she had learned to live light because heavy dreams were harder to carry. Julian listened the same way he had that first night, eyes forward, hands relaxed, never interrupting, and when he spoke, he chose his words carefully, telling her about long days that blurred together, about responsibility that came with numbers too large to feel real, about rooms where everyone watched each other and no one ever said what they meant. He did not talk about wealth, only about pressure, and Lena understood pressure better than most, even if hers wore a different face. One night, she brought her sketchbook with intention, sliding it across the table after hesitating, as if handing over a part of herself that had always been kept just out of reach, and Julian flipped through the pages slowly, stopping at a drawing of a woman asleep on the subway, her head tilted, her guard down, and said it felt honest, which mattered more than beautiful. That word stayed with her, honest, because it was what she was trying to be with him, even as a quiet voice in her head warned her not to trust ease, not to trust men who moved through the world without friction. The warning grew louder the night Julian offered to walk her home, all the way to Queens, a distance she knew most people with options avoided, and when she told him it was too far, he smiled and said distance only mattered if you were in a hurry, and for once, he was not. On the train, surrounded by tired faces and the rattle of steel, he looked out of place in his clean coat, but he did not shrink from it, standing beside her, holding the pole, listening as she explained which stops were safest late at night, a detail no one had ever cared to learn for her sake before. When they reached her block, she hesitated again, embarrassed by the narrow walk-up and the flickering hallway light, but Julian followed without comment, stepping into her small apartment where the heat worked only when it wanted to, and the walls were lined with sketches taped up because frames cost money. He did not offer solutions, did not look around with pity, he only said it felt like a place where someone lived, not just slept, and Lena felt something inside her loosen. That night, after he left, she sat on the edge of her bed holding the sketchbook, realizing how rarely she let anyone see her life without a filter, and wondering why it felt easier with him than it should have. Across the city, Julian stood alone in his penthouse, the quiet stretching wide, thinking about how easily he had blended into her world, and how dangerous that ease could become, because he knew there would be a moment when truth demanded more than silence, and he was not yet sure which version of himself she would recognize when that moment came. For now, he told himself, it was enough to sit at ordinary tables, drink ordinary coffee, and let the line he had whispered in a restaurant echo back to him. Every table is elite if you are invited to it, even as the invitation he feared most waited just ahead. As the weeks folded into one another, Lena Morales began to sense a shift she could not quite explain, a subtle tightening in the air whenever Julian's phone lit up, and he turned it face down without looking. Whenever a conversation drifted too close to names or places that carried weight, and she told herself it was none of her business because what they had was built in late nights and shared walks, not R.A. Sommets. Still, the change followed them, most clearly the evening Julian mentioned an upcoming charity gala, as if it were a weather update. Something unavoidable but unremarkable, saying he had an obligation downtown the following Friday and would not be able to see her after work. Lena nodded, pretending the word gala did not conjure images of rooms like the one where they had first met. Tables divided by signs she pretended not to notice, and the unspoken certainty that she would never belong in places like that. She tried to brush off the feeling, but it lingered as she worked her shifts, as she sketched between subway stops, as she listened to coworkers talk about people who lived lives so far removed they might as well exist in another city entirely. The night before the event, Julian stopped by the coffee shop earlier than usual, his energy different, restrained, and when Lena asked if he was nervous, he smiled and said it was just another room full of people who expected him to be someone specific, a comment that confused her more than it clarified. She wanted to ask what he meant, but instead she showed him a new drawing, a long table with no head, every seat the same, a quiet rebellion captured in pencil, and Julian stared at it longer than he should have, his expression softening in a way that felt almost like regret. The following evening, Lena finished her shift later than planned, exhaustion weighing down her shoulders as she stepped outside into the cool air, only to find the street alive with black cars and polished shoes, the glow of an event spilling onto the sidewalk from a building she recognized too well, the same kind of entrance she had learned to walk past without slowing down. She froze when she saw Julian across the way, dressed not in the clean coat she knew, but in a tailored suit that seemed to belong to him more completely, speaking to a man who nodded with deference, and for a moment she wondered if she should turn around, if this was not her place to be. But then Julian looked up and saw her, surprise flashing across his face before he excused himself and crossed the distance between them, his voice warm but cautious as he asked what she was doing there, and she laughed lightly, explaining she was just heading home, that she had not realized there was an event tonight. The lie sat between them, thin and fragile, and Julian hesitated, glancing back toward the entrance, then back at her, as if weighing two worlds in the span of a breath. He told her she looked tired, that he would call her later, and as he turned away, Lena felt something crack, a realization settling in that the man she had been walking beside through ordinary streets moved differently when those streets ended. She rode the subway home with the image fixed in her mind, Julian framed by glass doors and bright lights, and tried to reconcile it with the man who drank cheap coffee and listened to her talk about sketches and rent. Across town, Julian stood beneath chandeliers, hands shaking only slightly as he greeted donors and board members, his name spoken with familiarity and respect, and he wondered when silence stopped being protection and became betrayal, because he knew the next time Lena asked him who he really was, the answer would change everything they had built. The days after the gala felt heavier, as if an invisible door had closed between Lena Morales and the version of Julian she thought she knew, and yet he did not disappear, which made the distance harder to name. He texted the next morning, asking if she had gotten home safe, the familiarity of the question clashing with the image burned into her mind of him beneath chandeliers, and she answered yes without adding anything else, unsure how to translate the unease into words. When they met again, it was quieter than before, their conversation circling familiar ground without landing, until Lena finally asked what kind of obligation required a room full of people who looked like they had never checked a bank balance in their lives. And Julian paused long enough that she knew the answer mattered. He told her it was complicated, that he did consulting work tied to philanthropy and investments, that sometimes those worlds overlapped, and he spoke carefully, as if each sentence were a step across thin ice. Lena listened, nodding, but something in her tightened, not because the explanation was impossible, but because it felt incomplete, like a sketch with the center left blank. She changed the subject, pointing out a street musician, laughing too quickly, and Julian let it go, grateful and uneasy in equal measure. Over the next week, Lena found herself watching more closely, noticing the way Julian paid without looking at prices, the way people deferred to him when they crossed paths, the way his phone buzzed late at night with messages he did not read until he was alone, and she wondered how long she could pretend these were coincidences. One evening, after a late shift, she brought him to the small park near her apartment, the one with cracked benches and a view of the bridge, and they sat side by side as the city hummed around them, the space between them filled with things unsaid. Lena told him about her childhood, about growing up in a house where money was always the loudest voice, about learning early that survival meant shrinking your wants, and she admitted that the restaurant where they met had made her feel small long before she ever opened her mouth. Julian listened, his jaw tightening, and when she finished, he said softly that no one should feel smaller for asking a question, especially not one that only existed to keep others out. The words echoed his whisper from that first night, and Lena felt the pull of trust again, dangerous and warm, even as her instincts warned her that trust without truth was fragile. Julian wanted to tell her everything then, wanted to take her hands and lay out the facts he had been hiding behind simplicity, but fear held him back, fear that the moment he said his full name, the ease between them would shatter into caution and doubt. Instead, he asked about her sketches, about the drawing of the long table with no head, and Lena smiled sadly, saying it was about fairness, about the idea that no seat should come with more value than another. Julian nodded, thinking of boardrooms and power plays, of tables where decisions shaped lives far removed from the polished wood, and he realized that Lena was not just someone he cared about, she was a mirror reflecting the cost of the world he controlled. As they walked home, Lena slipped her hand into his without thinking, a small, instinctive gesture that startled them both, and Julian squeezed back, knowing that whatever came next would test whether the line he had whispered could survive the truth he had yet to speak. Because somewhere ahead, the distance between invited and excluded, between elite and ordinary, was about to collapse, and neither of them would be able to step away unchanged. The reveal came without warning on a night Lena Morales never planned to be part of, a night that began with a text from her manager asking if she could cover one more shift because a private event had booked the entire restaurant, the same downtown space she now recognized too well, and despite the knot in her stomach, she agreed because saying no had never been a luxury she could afford. When she arrived, the room had been transformed, the tables arranged in perfect symmetry, the lighting brighter, sharper, every detail designed to impress people who expected to be impressed, and as Lena tied her apron, she felt the familiar sense of shrinking, the old instinct to move quietly and stay invisible. She avoided the elevated section at first, focusing on her tasks until a ripple moved through the room, a shift in energy she felt before she saw it, the kind that made conversations pause and heads turn. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone, thanking donors and partners, his voice carrying easily, and Lena froze when she heard the name Julian Cross spoken clearly and confidently, followed by a wave of applause that filled the space like a physical force. Her breath caught as she looked up, her eyes finding Julian standing near the front, no longer the man who drank late-night coffee with her, but someone entirely claimed by the room. Shoulders squared, expression composed, every inch of him belonging there in a way she never had. She watched as people reached for his hand, congratulated him, spoke his name with familiarity and respect, and the truth settled over her in layers, heavy and undeniable, the consulting, the gala, the way doors opened for him without question, all aligning into a picture she could no longer ignore. When Julian's eyes met hers across the room, the world narrowed, the applause fading into a dull roar as recognition flashed across his face, followed by something like fear, and Lena knew in that instant that the silence between them had been a choice, not an accident. She stepped back instinctively, her tray shaking slightly as she retreated toward the service hall, her thoughts racing through every conversation, every careful omission, every moment of ease that now felt tainted by context. Julian excused himself as soon as he could, moving quickly through the crowd, catching up to her just outside the ballroom where the music dimmed and the air felt colder, and he called her name softly, not with authority, but with urgency. Lena turned, her expression steady but guarded, and asked him if Julian Cross was his full name, the words landing between them with finality. He nodded, beginning to explain, but she stopped him with a raised hand, her voice tight as she asked how long he had planned to let her believe he was someone else, someone simpler, someone safe. Julian tried to tell her that he never lied about who he was, only about what he owned, that he wanted to be seen without the weight of his title. That with her he had felt normal for the first time in years, but the words stumbled against the hurt already taking shape in her chest. Lena told him it was not the money that upset her. It was the power to choose when to reveal the truth, the way he had watched her step carefully through a world he controlled without ever telling her where the floor dropped away. She reminded him of the question she asked that first night, of how small it had made her feel, and how his whisper had mattered because it suggested equality, not secrecy. Julian listened, his face drawn, realizing too late that intention did not erase impact, and when Lena handed him her apron and said she needed air, needed distance, he let her walk away because stopping her would only prove her point. As she stepped out into the night, the city lights blurring through unshaded tiers, Lena understood that some tables revealed their true purpose only after you sat down, and inside the ballroom, Julian Cross stood alone amid applause, knowing that the line he whispered had finally been tested by the truth he had tried to outrun. After that night, the city felt sharper to Lena Morales, every sound louder, every reflection too honest, and she filled her days with motion to keep from thinking, taking extra shifts, sketching until her fingers ached, riding the subway past her stop just to delay the moment she would have to sit alone with what she felt. Friends noticed the change, asked questions she brushed aside, because explaining meant admitting how deeply the silence had cut, not because Julian Cross was wealthy, but because he had known when to step forward and when to stay hidden, and that choice had never been hers. She replayed the reveal again and again, the applause, the way his name filled the room, the look on his face when he saw her, and she wondered if every laugh they shared now carried a footnote she had not been allowed to read. Across town, Julian moved through his days like a man split in two, attending meetings, signing papers, answering to people who needed his decisions, all while the image of Lena handing him her apron refused to fade, a simple gesture that felt heavier than any loss he had measured in numbers. He tried to give her space, believing distance might cool the hurt, but silence only amplified it, and when days passed without a word, he realized that waiting was another form of control, one he no longer wanted to exercise. He reached out once, then again, messages he deleted before sending, because apologies written without action felt empty, and he knew this was not something words alone could mend. Lena, meanwhile, avoided the places they had shared, choosing different routes home, different coffee shops, trying to reclaim the version of herself that had existed before she trusted someone enough to believe his world could overlap with hers. One evening, after a long shift, she returned to her apartment to find an envelope slipped beneath her door, no logo, no return address, only her name written carefully on the front, and inside was her sketchbook, the one she had left behind in the rush of that night, along with a single note that did not explain or excuse, but simply asked if she would meet him somewhere neutral, somewhere that belonged to neither of their worlds. She stared at the paper for a long time, anger and curiosity pulling in opposite directions, until she folded the note and set it aside, unsure if seeing him would reopen wounds or finally allow them to heal. When she did not respond, Julian made a decision that surprised even himself, canceling appearances, postponing meetings, stepping away from the spaces where power insulated him, because he needed to understand the weight of what he had taken for granted. He walked the city the way Lena did, without drivers or assistants, noticing for the first time how often signs dictated who was welcome and who was tolerated, and the realization settled heavily that equality spoken softly in a restaurant meant little if it did not survive daylight. Days later, Lena found him waiting near the small park by her apartment. Not approaching, not intruding, just standing where she could choose to walk past or stop. And the choice, finally, was hers. She stopped. The conversation that followed was not dramatic, not loud, but it was honest, the kind that stripped away defenses, with Lena telling him how it felt to be managed by omissions, to be invited into a version of his life that excluded the parts that carried consequence, and Julian listening without interruption, accepting the truth without trying to reshape it. He told her he had been afraid, not of her judgment, but of losing the simplicity they shared, and that fear had led him to protect himself at her expense. Lena said that simplicity built on imbalance was not simplicity at all. It was a comfort designed for one side only. When they parted that night, there were no promises, only an understanding that something had broken and could not be rushed back into place, and as Lena walked away, she felt steadier, not because the pain was gone, but because she had named it, and somewhere behind her, Julian Cross stood alone, knowing that if he wanted a place at her table again, it would require more than an invitation, it would require change. The invitation arrived quietly, not with Julian Cross's name stamped in gold or delivered by anyone important, but as a simple card slipped into Lena Morales' locker at the restaurant, cream paper, black ink, an address she did not recognize, and a time written by hand, and beneath it a single line that made her pause. Tonight, no tears, no titles. She considered ignoring it, because distance had given her clarity, and clarity felt safer than hope, but curiosity, stubborn and human, won, and when her shift ended, she took the subway downtown, clutching her coat as the train rattled toward a neighborhood she rarely visited. The building was unremarkable from the outside, an old warehouse with lights glowing through tall windows, and inside, the air smelled faintly of paint and fresh wood. The space opened wide and unfinished, with long communal tables arranged end to end, no head, no raised platform, just chairs pulled close together as if expecting conversation. People stood scattered around the room, not dressed for galas or power meetings, but like neighbors and friends, artists, servers, volunteers, some she recognized from her own world, others unfamiliar, and on the walls hung her drawings, enlarged and framed, sketches she had made in passing, subway faces, tired hands, the long table with no head, each piece labeled not with prices but with small stories typed beneath, moments of quiet dignity. Lena stopped short, her breath catching, because the room felt like something she had imagined but never believed could exist, and then Julian stepped into view, not from a spotlight, but from beside her, dressed simply, his posture open, his expression steady and unguarded. He did not touch her, did not rush, he only said he was glad she came, and gestured to the room, explaining that he had spent weeks listening, asking people who were usually spoken for what would make a space feel fair, and then building it without barriers, without special access, because equality had to be designed, not declared. Lena walked slowly, reading the stories, seeing her own handwriting transformed into something shared, and she realized this was not a gift meant to impress her. It was an action meant to stand without her permission, something that would exist whether she accepted it or not. Julian told her the space would remain open, free, funded quietly, a place for anyone who had been told they did not belong to sit and be seen. And he said it without asking for credit, without saying his name, because this was not about redemption, it was about repair. When they reached the final wall, Lena saw the first drawing she had ever made of him, a quick sketch from the coffee shop, his face thoughtful, unaware, and beneath it the line he had whispered that first night, printed plainly, "Every table is elite if you are invited to it," followed by another sentence added below, "This one is for everyone." Lena turned to him then, the weight in her chest shifting, not disappearing but changing shape, because for the first time since the reveal, she saw his world bending instead of asking hers to stretch. Julian told her he understood if trust took time, that he was done choosing when to be seen, and that if he ever earned a place at her table again, it would be because he sat down honestly, not because he owned the room. Lena took a long breath, listening to the low hum of voices around them, the clink of mismatched chairs, the sound of a space alive, and she realized this was the justice she had needed, not flowers or apologies, but action that aligned with words. She did not forgive him in a rush, did not promise anything, but she stayed, pulled out her sketchbook, and sat at the long table. And when Julian asked quietly if he could join her, she nodded, leaving a chair open, not elevated, not reserved, just a place, and as they sat together, ordinary among many, the distance that once defined them finally began to close, not through whispered lines, but through a shared commitment to make sure no one ever had to ask if they were allowed to belong. The weeks that followed did not rush forward like a victory lap. They settled into a steadier rhythm, one built on presence instead of promise, and Lena Morales found herself returning to the warehouse space, not as a guest but as a contributor, adding new sketches to the walls, teaching small workshops, watching strangers take seats at the long table without asking permission. Julian Cross was there too, not hovering, not directing, but participating, listening more than speaking, learning how often leadership meant stepping back rather than standing at the front. Their conversations resumed slowly, honestly, no longer circling what was hidden, but grounded in what had been revealed, and Lena noticed how Julian introduced himself simply by his first name in that space, how he redirected praise to the people doing the work, how he stayed when it would have been easier to leave. Trust rebuilt itself, not through grand declarations, but through repetition, through consistency, through seeing the same choice made again and again. One evening, after the last guests had filtered out and the city outside hummed with late-night traffic, Lena remained at the table, sketching hands from memory, and Julian sat across from her, the chair scraping softly against the concrete floor, the sound ordinary and grounding. He watched her draw, the familiar quiet settling between them, and when she looked up, he smiled with the same warmth she remembered from that first night, but now without the weight of a mission. Julian told her he had stepped back from roles that thrived on separation, that he was restructuring parts of his work to support spaces like this one, not as charity but as collaboration, and Lena listened, recognizing that change was rarely loud. It was measured in what you were willing to give up. She closed the sketchbook and told him she no longer wanted to live her life shrinking around invisible lines, that she wanted to build something honest even if it took time, and Julian nodded, understanding that this was not a condition, it was a boundary. He reached into his pocket then, not with ceremony, but with intention, and placed something small on the table between them, not a ring, not a contract, but a simple brass plaque engraved with a familiar sentence, the line that had followed them from the beginning: "Every table is elite if you are invited to it." Lena touched it lightly, recognizing the weight of words that had been tested and reshaped by action, and Julian leaned in, his voice low but steady, repeating the line again, not as a whisper meant to shield her from judgment, but as a promise spoken openly, this time adding, "And I am asking if you will keep inviting me to yours, honestly, fully, as I am." The question landed without pressure, without spectacle, leaving room for her answer to matter, and Lena felt the truth of the moment settle into her bones. She thought of the restaurant, the sign, the way her voice had trembled when she asked if she belonged, and she realized how far she had come, not because someone else opened a door for her, but because she had learned to build her own tables. She nodded, a smile breaking through that carried both certainty and choice, and reached across to take his hand, the gesture simple and public in its own quiet way. Outside, the city continued on, indifferent and alive, but inside the warehouse, two people sat among empty chairs and shared work, equal not because circumstances had vanished, but because integrity had taken their place. Later, when the space grew into a permanent fixture of the neighborhood, people would ask how it began, and the answer would never mention wealth or status, only a question asked bravely, a line whispered with kindness, and the understanding that true belonging is not granted by signs or titles, but by the courage to make room and the commitment to stay. And if you ever find yourself wondering where you fit, remember this: every table can become elite the moment it chooses to welcome you.